Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that, I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest today is none other than the Duke of Wellington, the most magnificent title. It's not just the Duke of Wellington, of course. You are the one I really envy is Prince of Waterloo, and you're the Duke of Ciudad Rodrigo and the 9th Duke of Victoria, which are amazing titles, which all go back, of course, to the Iron Duke himself, your great predecessor. Most people call you Your Grace, or used to in the old days, but now that's completely changed. And so I feel totally entitled to call you Charles like everyone else does. And Charles, it's amazing, really. You've stood for election with having this incredible heritage and also the estates that you've been left, your predecessor was left to the nation, and an incredibly busy commercial life that you've decided years ago to become a politician. And I think it's extraordinary that you should actually ever want to do that. But take me back. I mean, in the early days, there must have been this great weight upon you in terms of the heritage of your family and what you were going to have to take over when you left school, etc.
Well, in my early 20s, I lived in and out of North America for about 3 years.
You'd left university at that point?
I'd left university. I'd been to Oxford.
Yes.
However, I then went to work in a South American investment boutique.
What, they were investing in South America? Or
mainly investing and lending in South America.
Gosh, amazing.
And I went there because I speak fluent Spanish.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting thing to do, and I don't regret it for a minute. It was extremely interesting. However, I did visit North America quite a lot during that period, and I saw how incredibly responsible the left wing of American politics were compared with the irresponsibility, as I then saw it, of the rather extreme left wing in British politics. And so when I came back, when my grandfather died, I came back to live in England. When the general election of March, I think it was, 74, was it February, was called, I rang up Conservative Central Office and offered my services.
Amazing. But coming back to your grandfather who died, am I right in saying that your father was not the direct descendant of the title? Did it move sideways because of death in the war?
No, my grandfather succeeded his nephew.
Yes.
His nephew was a young man killed in the commandos, in the landings at Salerno in Italy. He was a young man, unmarried, and of course no heir. He had no children, and he didn't have a brother. And so the title went to his uncle, my grandfather. So that's how it went.
And that came directly through your father, or?
And then that was my grandfather who succeeded his nephew. And of course, on his death, my father became the Duke, and on his death, I became the Duke. So we all descend actually from the second son of the first Duke, because the elder son of the first Duke didn't have children. He had a beautiful wife, sadly no children. So we descend from the younger son. But anyway, it's gone sideways a couple of times because another one didn't have children and he went to a brother.
But we're all surrounded in this country by the great victories of Wellington. He was our greatest soldier. You live in number 1 London, which is a house that was given, I think, to him as an Adam House given to him
He bought that.
He bought that. And the estate down in Hampshire.
The estate in Hampshire was given to my ancestor by Parliament. House of Commons voted an extraordinarily generous sum of money to provide an estate, a country estate for the Duke of Wellington and his heirs.
But having said all that, you have had a full-time task in maintaining that estate and building it. As you said, you learnt about land management, which is a great asset for the house. And it must have been in the case of your father, who was in the Lords until the 99 reform, I think.
Yes, but he didn't really play much part in the Lords. He wasn't very interested and hardly ever went to the Lords, and wasn't remotely interested in staying when the Hereditaries were asked to leave, and a few applied to be elected by their peers to remain.
Yeah.
And my father never put himself forward for that.
And I suppose you could have done at the time.
No, I was not then a peer.
Oh, you were not then
a peer.
You were,
yes,
because you weren't the Duke then, yeah.
No. And so I only became eligible to be elected, as I was eventually, on the death of my father.
Yeah.
And
and that was a totally different election, which we'll come to later. But in the meantime, you stood as a Conservative, coming back to your Conservative life, you stood as a Conservative candidate for North Islington, which must have been pushing water uphill.
I enjoyed it hugely. In the October 74 election, I was the candidate there. I enjoyed it very much. Of course, I was very unlikely to win that seat. My opponent was a long-standing Labour MP, Michael O'Halloran, and I knew I wouldn't win, but I enjoyed the fight, and I enjoyed the campaigning, and they were very decent, nice people in North Islington.
Your commitment to public service sort of went on. I mean, you became a councillor,
correct,
in Basingstoke, which is no mean feat in 78, and then and dealing with all the local issues, and then of course you ran for election as an MEP in 79. Yeah,
and I fortunately, all the seats were choosing at the same time, and I won the first one. I was in the final four, so I got Surrey, and I was very, very pleased to be elected to the European Parliament, because I really, really believed that the first international elected parliament of the then European Economic Community was something really worth doing, and I was pleased to be there.
Right. So what were the early days of the European Parliament
like? Well, it
like?
was, of course, extraordinary, because all the other countries had elected their representatives, their members of the European Parliament, on national list systems. So the leaders of all the political parties all over Europe were elected to the European Parliament, even though they were still active national politicians. So in the case of France, Chirac was elected as an MEP. So was Mitterrand. So was Poniatowski, who was a very senior lieutenant of Giscard d'Estaing, and so on and so on. I mean, it was a very, very interesting group of people. And it was rather a wonderful feeling to be part of this first elected parliament.
And the working week, I mean, you would presumably go to Brussels on a Monday.
We did 2 days, usually 2 or 3 days a week, once a month in Strasbourg, once a month, 2 weeks a month in Brussels. And the fourth week of the month was a party group meeting, which in our case was sometimes in London, sometimes in Denmark, because we were in alliance with the Danish Conservatives, and sometimes we went other capitals.
And in 89, as you said a few minutes ago, you decided not to carry on.
I decided not. I told my constituency I wasn't.
And why did you come to that
decision? Well, I thought I'd been there for 10 years. I'd done one of the subjects I was most interested in was the accession of Spain and Portugal to the EEC, because I thought it was really, really good for their democracies.
And interesting, of course, because you have strong family connections with both those countries.
Correct.
I think you have some land out in Spain and
we
Portugal.
Do. The Spanish Parliament gave my ancestor a property in Spain, which we still have.
Yeah. So that must have been wonderful for you to be part of that. So you gave that up, and I think from a political point of view, the next we see you is in sort of 2015. So what happened in between?
Well, after leaving the European Parliament, I was lucky enough to be asked to do some extremely interesting jobs in business. I became chairman of something called Dunhill Holdings, which was not tobacco, it was luxury goods, which eventually merged into the much larger group as it now is, called Richemont. And I was on that main board. I was on that main board for 27 years, I think, at the end, beyond all reasonable corporate governance guidelines. However, I enjoyed that very much, and I became chairman of Sun Life, which was a large life insurance company. And I was also chairman of a fund management company called Framlington, which not quoted. It was, but those were all very, very interesting jobs. And then eventually, I also then joined the board of a very interesting, large French pharmaceutical company called Sanofi, which is one of the global leaders in the pharmaceutical industry. That was incredibly interesting, even though I knew little to nothing about pharmaceutical subjects before I joined that board. So I've had a very, very interesting business
But also
life.
At the same time, these, as you said earlier, these estates and houses, they need a lot of upkeep. You've got to kind of commercialize a state. I mean, I know your daughter's got a brilliant farm shop, for example, which I've spent rather a lot too much money in.
Not sure that's very relevant to the House of Lords, but yes, that is true.
But I mean, you must have had quite a plan.
Well, no, I've been lucky that I was able to do this. We had good people managing, and I was able to do it at weekends and when other times when I wasn't busy on other things.
Yeah.
And in 2015, I asked our elder son to take over the management of the estate in Hampshire, and so he now does that.
Which freed you up to
join the Lords.
I mean, it is an extraordinary thing, isn't it, that in the 99 Act, there was a 92 hereditaries that were left, that then becomes this election process where if you want to become a hereditary peer, you have to stand for election amongst your peers. And you decided you would. And I can't remember, was your election just within the Conservative within the peers or within the whole House?
I personally think it was a pity that they made most of the 90, to be precise, 75 of them, I think it is, are elected by party groups.
Yeah.
And only 15 of them are elected by the whole House. I think it was a pity that they weren't all to be elected by the whole House, but that's the way it's worked out. And although there are those who wish to reform or indeed abolish the election system for hereditary peers, which I quite understand, I would have preferred them to propose that the elections be by the whole House. I think that would have been a more sensible amendment to the original arrangement. However, I think it's probably moved on from there, and I suspect that at some point the government will give time, or a government will give time, to the bill by Lord Grocott to do away with the hereditary by-elections. Because I understand they are open to some degree of skepticism.
Well, you're a case in point of why we should continue to have hereditary peers in the House of Lords.
Well, that's nice of you to say so, but it is.
Well, I'm not saying it. I mean it. And it would be the case with a good many of the hereditaries that they're fully committed to the future of the House of Lords, whether they're in it. So, but it's a point of discussion.
I mean, on that point, of course, it is difficult to justify, in one sense, in a modern legislature, that some members are there by effectively inheritance in some way, even though modified by election. But I personally find that less indefensible than what I have personally, I do find very distasteful, that certain peers are nominated by party leaders partly because they have been generous donors to that particular political party, not just the Conservatives. Other parties have done that. And I do think that is very regrettable. And I think that is not a principle that I would ever support.
Obviously, I sort of kind of fit in that category as I was treasurer of the Conservative Party. But I think that the overarching thing has got to be what those people have done for life and what they have done outside of the political world. And so many of them have been extremely successful business leaders, and you and I know who they are. So I think you have to mix it up, but I see your point of view. And I'm not here to argue with your eminence, your grace on this matter. So you're a very active peer. I know this. You're there most days. Very active, and became a thorn in the side of our great party. But up to that point, frustrations may well have been building because of the position you took on Europe and the eventual Brexit. These were very charged times.
But in that sense, I was much more mainstream conservative than might have been imagined, because after all, it was a relatively small group of Conservative MPs who voted consistently against Mrs. May's proposals for the Withdrawal Act. Every time I spoke in the Lords, I said, if I had been an MP, I would have voted for Mrs. May's proposal. So I was not against the principle that we were leaving. Clearly we were leaving. There had been a referendum and that had been confirmed. But as far as I was concerned, in the two party manifestos at the 2017 general election, in which both parties agreed to respect the outcome of the referendum. So I had accepted totally that we were leaving. I just wanted to make sure we left on better terms than I think we in the end achieved.
But it was a perfectly understandable point of view for you to take. I mean, you'd experienced the European Parliament. You have strong heritage within Europe. You've been part of it since the beginning. So it's perfectly understandable that you should take that case. And also it's perfectly understandable the reasons you gave for leaving the party. And, that's the beauty of the Lords, is that you can retain that independence.
Absolutely. And I actually think that that mentality of independence is very desirable amongst members of the House of Lords, because we've this afternoon been voting on various points of the illegal migration bill, and I have noticed Conservatives voting against the government, some very convincing speeches against the bill from Conservative Baroness Hillich, Baroness Mubarak, and so on. So I think there are all sorts of matters that come to the Lords where I think it is right that people exercise their independent judgment if they don't agree with their party, whichever party that may be.
Well, I think that is the thing about the Lords, is that, and what we're conveying in these conversations is that it has independent people, it has people with great experience, and you've got experience, as you say, in business, in agriculture and state management, all these things that many MPs never have, that they can bring that experience to bear into challenging, on the one hand, the House, and also ensuring the legislation is fit for purpose. Which brings us on nicely to, I think, your great triumph of recent times. And I don't say this loosely, and it's become such a huge topical issue, where you really did lead the way on the Environment Bill to reduce pollution from dumping of sewage in rivers.
Well, it's terrible.
Where did you? That became a sort of kind of campaign for you. Where did you sort of first get the real urge to take this on as your cause?
There was a very good panorama program, I suppose now 3 years ago, which exposed the extent to which Thames Water were dumping sewage into the River Thames. And it was completely revolting, the sight of the river bed of the Thames being covered in material deposited in lavatories all over London, and sewage, and the colour of the water and everything. And really one felt that, at least I felt, that it was unimaginable that this should still be going on in Britain in 2020. And I really felt this was something we had to do something about. So when the Environment Bill came to the House of Lords, having passed through the Commons, very interestingly there was I think they call it a select committee or a bill committee in the Commons, which had proposed 200 amendments to the Environment Bill. Not one of them was accepted, or indeed, I think most of them weren't even debated or voted on, because the government has such a large majority. And as you know, we have a system in the Lords that any amendment tabled has to be debated.
Yeah.
And any member has the right to table an amendment. In the Commons, that is not the case. So we are much more able as backbenchers in the Lords to have some influence.
Yeah. So the bill sailed through, came into the Lords.
Sailed through the Commons, came into the Lords, and in the second reading speech, I brought up this subject, and I quoted the Environment Agency figures of the number of spills of sewage into our rivers in the last year. And these were not my figures. They were from the Environment Agency. And it was a figure of something like 400,000, as I remember. And no other person speaking in the second reading referred to this figure, and nobody corroborated it. And a former chief executive of the Environment Agency spoke in the debate and used a completely different figure, much lower figure. So, I mean, that was the degree of lack of knowledge amongst many members. The minister then dealing with it, Lord Goldsmith, Zach Goldsmith, I don't think he even was really aware of it. And I remember in my second reading debate saying that I really did think watching this panorama program was a necessary for all ministers in DEFRA to do, because only if they had seen that program could they begin to understand the degree of the problem. And I really believe, quite genuinely, it's not a party political point, and nor indeed really a criticism of the ministers concerned, but I just think there was a lack of knowledge amongst ministers as to how serious the problem was.
So just to explain what process you have to go through to make a change to a bill, you put down your amendments at second reading.
No, you can't put them down in the committee stage.
I'm sorry, committee stage.
You put down your
even I know that.
And I was very keen to have on my amendment one backbencher from the Liberal Democrats, from Labour, and from Conservative. The front bench Labour spokesman offered to sign my amendment, and I asked them not to, because I said I didn't want this to be seen by the government as an official opposition move. I wanted backbenchers from all four groups. Yeah. And I think that was the correct tactic, because it became accepted as a cross-party movement, if I can call it that. And I think that's what led to its ultimate success.
And now, of course, it is the topic of the moment in the environment.
Sadly, it has become that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of discussion now about nationalisation of the water companies and things like that. Do you see that as the way of...
I mean, I'm not in favour of that. I think privatising the water companies was probably the right thing to do at the time. And certainly it freed up a lot of capital to be invested, which would not have been available. The Treasury would never...
Yeah, people forget they were starved of capital before they were.
Of course they were. Yeah. Of course they were. So I'm not in favour of nationalisation. What I think the water companies have been guilty of, and we have to accept this, that in 33 years, 34 years, or whatever it is since they were privatised, they have allowed, first of all, the original public ownership, shareholder ownership, has in many cases passed to private equity groups, which is perhaps not the best type of owner for a public utility. Firstly. Secondly, they've restructured the capital of these companies, and there's a lot more debt. The amounts of investment required were not raised through equity, they were raised through debt. So I think that's turned out to probably been a mistake. Thirdly, I think the financial regulator, which is Ofwat, not the Environment Agency, Ofwat has not overseen with enough foresight the capital structures of these companies. Because after they have, in a sense, a veto power, because they have to approve the business plans of these companies before they're allowed to put up the charges. And so they have had an oversight, a financial oversight of these companies over a very long time. And I'm not sure they've really been alert enough to the developing problem of too much debt, insufficient equity investment, and inappropriate ownership. Because I'm afraid I don't really believe that a private equity group is necessarily the right long-term owner for what is a public utility and a monopoly.
I think
a regulated monopoly.
Yeah, I mean, Ofwat have been asleep at the wheel, there's no question, and you've exposed this. And I'm sure if you look back now, you'll think this is one of your great achievements, and I think we owe you debt. I mean, moving back, if you like, to your non-political life, you've been very active in King's College London, where you were chairman of the governing body for,
which was a very, very interesting
years. 2007.
I did that for 9 years, which is the statutory maximum. I was allowed to do it. I would have happily gone on longer, but we had a 9-year rule, and of course I respected it. It was a very interesting thing because, of course, you work with very clever people, and the whole strategy of a university, particularly a major one centred in London, is extremely interesting. King's College
has been hugely successful.
Happens to have one of the largest medical schools in the country, if not in Europe, because they have 4 different hospitals working with the university: King's College Hospital, Guy's Hospital, St Thomas's Hospital, and the Maudsley, which is a psychiatric hospital. So that side of it was very, very interesting. And of course, they have a very active humanities side, well known for war or defense studies and many other humanities subjects. And also, I was able to help them in that period get the East Wing of Somerset House, which they had always been meant to have. When my ancestor founded King's College, he suggested that they be located in the East Wing of Somerset House. And we were able to achieve that while I was chairman. So that was satisfactory. And that, by the way, was resisted in 1829 by the civil servants who then were all located in Somerset House and didn't want to be moved out. So that was quite an ironic twist, but it took a long time to get there. And also, very importantly, when the BBC moved out of Bush House, we were able to secure that for King's College. So that really was a significant change, and it's now been pedestrianised.
Yeah, no,
so it really has created
a
very good campus.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. So finally, you're very active in the Lords. What's the next big?
I'm too old to be ambitious anymore.
No, that's unfair. You might have said that in 2015, 2021, but
I look upon service in the Lords as being public service. I know it's not often considered that, but I personally consider it public service. I consider it non-party political in my fortunate situation of being a crossbencher, and I am only interested in trying to help the governance of this country by really good scrutiny of legislation in the Lords. And I genuinely believe that the Lords does perform an important role in improving legislation. And there are many ways to illustrate that, but we now have a Scottish Parliament. Scottish Parliament, unfortunately, doesn't have a second chamber. And as a result, I believe a number of long-term mistakes have been made.
Because there's been no scrutiny
of a second chamber.
Because there's been
no proper
scrutiny. It's a very good point.
By a second chamber. And as you know, serving in the Lords, we really do scrutinise bills you might almost say in too much detail. But the fact is, we go into a lot of detail, very long sittings, very detailed debates. And on the whole, I think we improve the legislation. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think we do.
Well, it's incredibly kind of you to come and spare the time. It's been really fascinating, and keep up the good work, I think, is the answer, isn't it? Thank you very much, Charles.